South Africa's major cities remain attractive investment destinations, but their shine is rapidly fading. This is according to the 2023 Global Cities Report by management consulting firm Kearney. It represents a mixed bag of results for Africa. Let's unpack this further now. I'm joined by Well-Governed Cities Program Manager Danga Mughogho. Danga, good afternoon. Welcome to today, and thank you very much for your time. I saw a report about this 2023 Global Cities Report. I haven't read the whole report, but I saw another media report about it. They are saying basically the results of it are showing a mixed bag for African cities. If you can begin there broadly, I mean, how are we in Africa doing in terms of our urban cities?
Well, actually, the article is quite interesting because it tends to focus, in fact, in detail on the two South African cities, focuses on Cape Town and Johannesburg, and doesn't really speak in great detail about African cities, although saying that in many cases, according to the two indices that they use, the African cities, in fact, stayed steady or slightly improved their performance. And I think drawing that distinction actually is important to make because, as we know, in many cases and when one looking at the emerging markets, in fact, unfortunately, on some metrics, there are African cities where, in fact, capital has been going because those cities are seen as areas where there are greater returns to that capital. So I'm thinking of some of those cities in West Africa. You think of Lagos, you think of cities in East Africa, such as Nairobi and so on.
Okay, now let's come to closer home now, Joburg and Cape Town. When you look at them, I mean, some of us who live in Johannesburg, what does it position itself as? World-class African city, and it's a city of gold, but we know that all that glitters is not gold.
Yes, that's correct. And in fact, looking at the article, because that actually was the prompt for the interview, I mean, I must say, I think the article, as I said, only focuses on Joburg and Cape Town, and yet the headline says, our cities are in trouble in general. The organization I work for, the South African Cities Network, focuses on the biggest cities in the country, so the metropolitan municipalities plus Msunduzi. And in 2022, we released two major reports: the State of South African Cities, which is every 5-year report looking at cities' performance, and then also the State of City Finances, which also looked at a 10-year view of city finances. And so once again, taking away from that specific newspaper article, but just speaking to the state of cities in general, and as you said, Joburg in particular, I think it is fair to say that on a number of dimensions, there are reasons for concern. And the State of South African Cities report in particular focused on the governance issues.
Yeah. Can we unpack your situation, your report rather, that you do every 5 years? I mean, we're using this article as a springboard just to look at the state of our cities. I mean, Johannesburg, you said there are signs of concerns. What are they?
Yes, well, I think this is a trend that applies across our cities, and in particular we've seen since 2016 with the increased competition. And so cities are previously controlled by one government and now have coalition governments. So where there's instability in the politics, and particularly in Joburg, which is the biggest city in the country, the city that produces the most economic output, it's been a concern because what tends to happen is when there's instability in the politics, that tends to have a knock-on effect in the administration. So the actual people who do the jobs, which is, making sure that we have water, making sure we have electricity, making sure that infrastructure is maintained. And it's something true of all organizations, but in particular in the public sector, when you have that instability, it has a knock-on effect. And as you would know, that's why we see reports about, for example, declining focus on infrastructure. That's why we've seen the problems around roads, around the electricity substations not being maintained, and so on. And I think it's fair to say that is quite worrying and is a trend that we would hope is altered. The report also noted that one of the things that we see across our big cities is that although, yes, they are in general, achieving the basic services which they're mandated to do, they have grown and have dealt with that challenge of service delivery. But the bigger outcomes, because let's remind ourselves that in our country, we had much bigger outcomes than just simply receiving electricity and water. So some of those larger developmental outcomes in our local government white paper of 98, for example, cities are still struggling to achieve. And the reason for that is tied partly to this governance question, but also tied to their state of finances. And so what we do find is that across our cities, there's been underinvestment in infrastructure, which then leads to this economic growth. And I think perhaps that article, which was talking about the things that draw a city to, or draw rather investment to the city, is having good infrastructure.
You mentioned governance. If you look at our cities, you are looking at the major ones in the country. I mean, nobody would want to invest in a place where there's instability governance-wise, as we've seen. I mean, coalition governments not really working out. But Cape Town has performed differently, for example, or has it?
Well, I think it would be performing different simply because of that stability. And I think what we saw in Johannesburg, for example, up to 2016 was a great degree of stability. What we saw in Nelson Mandela Bay post-night 2016 was a lot of instability, and that had a knock-on effect. And so much so, in fact, that the Nelson Mandela Bay Chamber of Commerce engaged with the city. And that's another thing that we're calling for in our report, which is to say that it's actually important for cities to engage with all of society. And this report calls for a whole of government and an all of society approach. So we are all involved in this. We're all in this together. So the private sector needs to engage with cities because there are things that cities can't necessarily do. And the truth of the matter is they don't actually create jobs. They create the environment for jobs.
Yes.
But in order to create that environment, they need to engage with the private sector to know exactly what is required and where. And then you have that discussion and then the two parties work together. So I think this antagonistic relationship, well, not necessarily antagonistic, but perhaps not so much engaging with other stakeholders. Yeah. And indeed, the founding legislation calls for that. And it's just something that has dropped by the wayside, but we're very much emphasize that this should be taking place from now on.
Yeah, Danga, outlook-wise, our cities, I mean, from the reports you've been doing yourselves as a cities network over the years, every 5 years, and just reading this one that we use now, this article to talk about this, what's the outlook like when you look for a bigger picture, our cities going forward? We live in a fast-changing world, technologically and otherwise. There's population growth, there's all kinds of pressures as well. I'm thinking of Johannesburg, I'm thinking of Durban, I'm thinking of Cape Town.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. And indeed, what we also say in the State of City Finances report, which reports on, as I said, the finances of the cities, the most important finding, in fact, is that cities are dependent on the growth of the economy in general. So, in fact, the wider conversation, of course, that you have mediated among many different stakeholders around the general state of the South African economy, the structural reforms that need to happen. When the country's economy grows, cities themselves grow as well. And there are many factors in terms of that wider growth of the country, systemic changes which aren't actually within cities' control. And so we really call for all of government and for all of us as citizens, in fact, to apply our minds to making sure, for example, that that we have electricity. So not having electricity has a knock-on effect on the businesses that operate in a city, for example. Okay. That's just one example. But there are many other areas in which, when we have good economic growth, cities themselves will grow, and the majority of the population lives in cities at this point. And so really a rising tide lifts all boats, and it's never truer than in the case of the economy.
Yeah, and then investment opportunities will come. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon on Today. That's Danga Mughogho. He's a program manager for World Governed Cities Program Manager for the South African National Cities Network. Well,